Okay, I want to thank everybody for attending another Lancaster Safety Consulting webinar, or LSCI as more commonly known. This webinar is obviously going to be on the new confined space or confined space entry requirements. Now, obviously, OSHA has done an update on this, and there's been certainly some changes. Some things remain the same, and myself, my name again is Nick, and Mike Rubio, who's one of our main trainers here at LSCI, is going to be taking us through and kind of explaining what this all means, how this affects your business, and what to be looking out for as this rollout happens. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Mike and let him kind of go through some of the key points we'll be discussing.
Yeah, thanks,
today.
Nick. Thanks for that introduction. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go through a number of different areas of concern here, and like you said, this is probably one of the more serious regulation changes that's come out recently, as not following the guidelines that we're going to discuss could lead to some significant issues on site, ultimately fatalities. So let's just take this one at a time here. We're going to go through these bullet points as we go through this presentation, excuse me, but we're going to talk about the new confined space regulation. We're going to go through more or less all the key points. We're going to talk about factors that categorize what a confined space is. So we're going to talk about confined spaces. Generally speaking, we're also going to talk about permit required confined spaces. We're going to talk about physical and atmospheric hazards. I'm going to probably put a little bit more special emphasis on the atmospheric portion, just because those are just so there's so many variables associated with hazardous atmospheres, and if you're really not doing your due diligence and performing adequate monitoring, that could be extremely dangerous. We're gonna go over proper steps employers should take. That's one of the other significant changes with this, Nick, is that everybody on site is going to be held accountable. So everyone from the host employer, which I'll explain these terms a little bit later, everybody from the host employer down to the general contractor, down to the entry employer, are going to have some more responsibility. We're also going to discuss training. Now, essentially, as we go through this, the training is going to more or less mirror the information that we're going to be presenting. So as long as your employees are trained on these factors that we're going to discuss during this webinar, you should be well covered. Now, that's not going to mean you're going to be covered for every single space that you can go into or enter. That training it can and should be specific to that exact job. We're going to talk about contractor and subcontractor responsibilities. We'll recap multi-employer job sites in that section. We're going to talk about standards to follow if you fall under both general industry as well as construction. And I'll kind of give you a little teaser to that right now. OSHA has already kind of laid the groundwork for that if you are following the construction regs, the new regs that we're speaking about currently, that you'll be in compliance. And lastly, towards the end, or right at the end, when we wrap this up, Nick will be able to provide everybody with a little bit of insight on where they could access some more free information.
Oh yeah, and about that, obviously we have a lot of information on our website, and we'll be posting a link later on. You can click right on, takes you right to our website, has some really useful information, and as always, you can go on to OSHA.gov. There's obviously a ton of information about that. But Mikey, why don't we focus on, to begin with, why did OSHA implement the new rule? I mean, what is this all about? What was the thinking or the thought process behind it?
Good question, Nick. And one of the reasons that this was such a necessary change was that confined space work can be extremely dangerous. And I think a lot of companies, I mean, especially since my background deals with construction, I think a lot of companies, they're hardworking. I think they have safety at the forefront, but they also want to go in and get the job done. And when it comes to confined space work, if you overlook just one minor aspect of it, it can result in a fatality. So they just wanted to shore things up a little bit. They want to make sure that employers are going to do what's right by their employees. They're going to make sure that it's safe for them to enter. But like I said earlier, they're going to spread this onus out among all contractors on site. I mean, any contractors that are going to be around the confined space work, are going to have any involvement with it, site owners, building owners, general contractors, everybody's going to have to be on the same page. You know, the days of pointing fingers and saying, well, you know, I didn't have anything to do with it, or, you know, my employees aren't going into space. Those days are pretty much over. If you're on site and you can be affected or can affect that confined space work at all, you're going to be involved in this. As you can see, Dr. David Michaels kind of sums that up right there with that excerpt from a speech that he performed. This standard will be effective on August 3rd, 2015.
Okay, well, why don't we go into what is a confined space? Because I'm sure a lot of people, they've heard the term before. I'm sure that plenty of our clients and a lot of companies out there listening today, they kind of have an idea what it is. But why don't we go back to basics and really define exactly what makes a confined space a confined space?
Sure, Nick. A confined space consists of a three-part definition. So the first thing we need to determine is that the space is large enough so that we can go in and perform some type of work. Now, the key with that is you have to be able to bodily enter. So it's something large enough that the worker can enter. Limited means of entry or exit, so it's difficult to get in or out of. An example of this could be a space in which we need a ladder to descend into or ascend back out. And it's not designed for continuous occupancy, meaning under normal conditions, it's not a location, it's not an environment in which employees should be for any long period of time.
Okay, and with that, you know, this regulation came out, and originally the date of August 3rd was thrown around a lot. Everybody was talking about August 3rd, and now all of a sudden this October 2nd comes up. And I know there's been a lot of confusion with people we've been talking to about what are these two deadlines, what does that mean, and why is there two dates that are being pushed by
Sure,
OSHA?
I could elaborate on that a bit. This kind of caught people off guard, and due to that, OSHA will, I'm not going to really say that this is a grace period, but they're going to postpone enforcement for an additional 60 days from the August 3rd, the third effective date. However, what you have to do is you have to basically be able to prove that you're making a good faith effort in complying with the final rule. And the next slide I can elaborate.
Well, that's the thing, I think, is the good faith. What does it mean to be making a good faith
Sure.
effort?
I have a number of items here on this next slide that we can take a look at, and we could delve into that a bit more. But basically, you have to be able to prove that you either have things in place or you're on the plan to get things in place. You have training scheduled. You're able to back that up with documentation. You may have purchased equipment or you have sales receipts that state that. Now, mind you, the whole time that this is taking place, you have to have alternative safety measures in place as well. Any additional efforts to train employees on the new changes, that all comes into play.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that what we really need here is people need to be making steps, taking progress towards it. They don't necessarily need to meet the objective by August 3rd and all the guidelines, but what they need to be doing is obviously showing OSHA that they are moving in that direction. So really, what has changed? I mean, you know, obviously there were confined space regulations, you know, well before this deadline came out. You know, we've been training this for years, obviously. What's the difference between now and then?
Well, Nick, they're not reinventing the wheel. A lot of these guidelines we've talked about in general industry for years. And like I said before, the plan with this is to put some reassurances in place that employers are going to do what they need to do to basically provide a safe workplace to their employees. And if that means performing air monitoring, you know, providing additional training, determining the hazards, and that's what it's going to boil down to. But the 5 key differences from general industry, or I should say revisions, we're going to talk about more provisions for multi-employer job sites, and I kind of touched on that on the previously in the beginning of this, where there are going to be some requirements for other contractors on site. OSHA is going to require a competent person to be available. This individual is going to basically oversee all entry, all proceedings and what occurs during the actual confined space work as well as afterwards. Procedures for continuous atmospheric monitoring when possible. I mentioned before that construction confined space hazards can vary greatly. Things can change very suddenly on a job site, and due to that, if feasible, continuous monitoring is highly recommended. And otherwise, if you can't prove it's not possible, they're going to want to see that. If anything, periodic monitoring. Suspension of the permit if hazardous conditions change. So a permit will not be completely be required to be canceled out altogether. But the key there is if conditions warrant such, entrance will be removed from the space. The conditions can be made safe again for reentry, and the permit can be reestablished.
Well, in this regulation was, a couple hundred pages or 600 pages. So really, what's been added?
Well, the added provisions, if you want to call them that, or just sections, provisions that have been clarified a bit more from the general industry aspects. Prevention of physical hazards must be implemented by way of elimination or isolation, essentially isolating the space. We'll talk about that a little bit later, some examples of isolation. Rescue arrangements is another key point of this change. A lot of companies kind of let this slide. They assume that local responders will be available to not only enter a space but effectively retrieve an injured or downed employee. So some reassurances will have to be made there. And employers are going to have to provide training for all employees. And you can see here it states that the training has to be in a language, format, vocabulary that the employees can read or understand. And due to our ever-changing workforce, we're becoming more diverse, and this is a key point.
And really digging deeper on that, though, when we look at why OSHA did this, it's really about the injuries, the illnesses, and the accidents. I mean, working confined space is one of the more dangerous hazards that we have, in really the working environment we have today in the United States. So, can you elaborate a little bit on that and maybe strengthen maybe OSHA's case for that matter?
Sure, Nick. As far as illnesses go, I don't think we could really put our finger on how many have occurred since confined space work existed. We have to imagine that exposures to certain materials while in confined spaces can have an accumulative effect. Yeah, so those numbers are pretty difficult to narrow down. As far as fatalities are concerned, OSHA estimates that there are somewhere around 90 fatalities that occur each year due to confined space activities. And most of those, and as well as the serious injuries, are due to a number of the bulleted items that you see on this slide. So lack or failure thereof of recognition of space hazards. So not doing adequate checks or maintaining the proper provisions prior to entry. Lack of training, that could be on entry procedures themselves or how to use safety equipment while in the space. No documented safe entry procedures. I'll probably make mention at some point in time to JSAs. We really recommend companies have those and they follow them.
Mike, when you say JSA, not everybody out there is obviously a safety professional listening in today. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what a JSA even is?
Sure. A job safety analysis. It's more or less a breakdown of the steps associated with the job, an additional association with the hazards and how you're going to correct those hazards or eliminate them. And as we continue on, air monitoring or lack thereof, I mentioned earlier that's probably one of the more higher variable aspects of entry. It's for the simple fact that unless you have monitoring equipment available, it's going to be very difficult to determine things such as lack of oxygen content, hazardous materials, flammable gases, you name it. Lack of permit system. So we'll talk about the permitting system here in a little bit. And that more than anything, it more or less requires people to act. Yes, it's a guide, but if it's filled out and it's not pencil whipped, it's going to provide, especially entrance, with the reassurances that all of those entry criteria were met. And we'll also talk about effective rescue procedures. And you can see there, that's one of the other leading causes of fatalities, lack thereof of effective rescue procedures.
Okay, so basically, Okay, so basically, a lot of the reason why this is happening is OSHA wanted to double down and make sure that, you know, they're out there to save people's lives and prevent injuries, and this is obviously something that they feel they could do better. But we talked about what the definition of a confined space. I think it's good to give examples because picture paints 1,000 words, so to speak. And why don't we go through some examples of those confined spaces and what people should be looking out for on, when to identify when these regulations would kick in.
Sure, and there are two types of confined space work practices. We have non-permit. I mean, these are typically reserved for non-hazardous work, and we have permit required. And I want everybody to realize that these changes, these additional requirements that we're speaking of, these are only specific to permit required confined spaces, spaces that pose additional hazards. But examples of confined spaces in general can be anything from what you see listed on this slide to different types of sewers, storm drains, lift stations, different types of pits. We could be looking at elevator pits, escalator pits, different types of vaults. Could be electrical vaults, different types of utility vaults, in addition to some of the more common tanks, hoppers, trailers, even attics and crawl spaces.
And isn't that one of the things they recently added to, or the attics and crawl spaces?
Yes, you're correct, Nick. So OSHA will provide some guidance on safe entry into those locations. A person might not think that an attic or a crawl space is exceptionally hazardous, but this time of the year, with temperatures reaching the 80s and 90s pretty much across the country, an attic can be upwards of 100 degrees or better, and heat stress can really be a concern.
So let's look at this though. We're talking about your normal confined spaces, but now there's this permit required confined space. So what's the distinction there? I mean, that seems kind of ambiguous.
Well, like I said before, we have a couple different types. Your regular run-of-the-mill confined space meets that three-part definition that we discussed previously. The permit required confined space, however, contains or has thereof one of these bulleted items. So there's a potential or does contain a hazardous atmosphere. There's a material in the space that could possibly engulf the entrant. Typically, this could be a liquid, or this could be a very finely divided material that could cause asphyxiation. The internal configuration is difficult to get around. That could also put somebody in a bind, so to speak, or any other serious safety hazards. Now, you can declassify spaces if you can effectively eliminate the hazard, like lockout, tag out. But if the hazard's there and there's no true or real way to eliminate it, it's typically going to require a permit.
So basically, you need your run-of-the-mill confined space, but then there's additional hazards that would make it an additional danger to be working within there. Is that
exactly?
Correct?
And that's the whole idea behind the permit. It's to make sure that before entry occurs, all the criteria necessary to go in and perform the work has been established, and it's been reviewed.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But now, you alluded to this earlier. You were talking about how different companies on the same job site are going to obviously be responsible. And I know the multi-citation policy from OSHA has been out there for a while now, but apparently this is resurfacing as far as this confined space goes. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening with
Sure,
that?
Nick. So multi-employer work sites, nothing's changed here. We just wanted to add this in just to make sure that everybody is aware that when you're on a site, when you're on a construction site with multiple entities working, it really doesn't matter who creates the hazard. What matters is whose company's employees are exposed to the hazard. So you can have what we would call a creating employer. This could be an employer that caused the initial hazardous condition. They violate a standard. You have the exposing employer. I mean, and again, these could be multiple entities here. But the exposing employer would be an employer whose employees are exposed to the hazard. We have the correcting employer, and ultimately we have the controlling employer. And an example would be a general contractor. This entity could be responsible for everything that goes on site. And the key here is that, like I said before, there's going to be more accountability. Just pointing fingers and saying, well, we don't have anything to do with that over there. If you look a bit further, you might. And one of the problems that OSHA cites directly is how other contractors can affect permit required confined space work. An example would be if an employee is in a confined space and something's introduced to the same system, maybe upstream. It could be a gas, it could be a chemical, it could be some type of liquid. I mean, it could even be other physical hazards. That is going to affect other people. So putting everybody in the same pot, so to speak, and making sure that everybody's has an active role is key here.
So basically, you know, if you have employees on the site, you're responsible. There's no point of finger saying, there's no deflecting responsibility. This is all about OSHA making sure that everyone owns up to their responsibilities. If you put your employees on the site in any capacity, then again, you're required by law to make sure that they're ensuring their safety. Well, I really love this flow chart here, and you can obviously break this down much further, but this will obviously go into a lot more, like, you know, exactly what this all means. So, you know, starting with the host employer, Mike, what exactly does that all mean?
This is a little bit. It might seem a little bit comprehensive at first, but really it's not. It's not that complicated. The flow chart does break it down to its most minimal aspects here. The host employer is essentially the property owner, the entity that owns the property. It could be a building. They have ultimate responsibility on site. So it starts with them. If there are confined spaces present, they have to basically communicate that to the controlling contractor, which another term could be used as a general contractor, and then ultimately down to any of the subcontractors, or we could also use the term entry employer. It's just a chain of communication. It trickles down from the top, and once the work's performed, it's going to go right back up. So any debriefing is going to be performed. Any problems in the space are going to be discussed. As you can see, as we look at these next two slides, this kind of breaks down the responsibilities a bit more, a little bit more detail. I'd like to go spend a little bit of time and go through these and just emphasize some of these points. But you can see the host employer, they're going to provide the following, if available. And then the key there is if it is available. I mean, things can come up and change very rapidly on a construction site, but as soon as the information is available to be conveyed to other entities, it needs to happen. So the locations of each known permit space. And a key with this is that signage or another effective means will have to be posted. Just like when you walk into a general industry environment, you see signage on tanks, vessels, you name it. The same thing will apply to a construction site. That way, everybody else there is going to know that that structure or whatever the case may be is a permit required confined space. So the location, the hazards, any other known precautions, that all has to be discussed. The controlling contractor, you know, they have a duty to obtain that information. So they just can't sit back and wait. You know, they have to make an effort to acquire that information from the host employer. They have to also provide the following to each other entity. So the general contractor, it's going to trickle right down to the people who are typically going to enter, and it's more of the same. Any of the information received from the host, additional information about the controlling contractor has about the subjects, and known precautions to implement. We move right along to the entry employer. You know, these are the individuals that are ultimately going to enter the space and perform the work. So, you know, once all the information's compiled, it's gathered, it's discussed, they just have to verify it. You know, they're going to obtain it. They're going to go through it, make sure it's consistent with their own in-house written safety program. And I mean, typically the operations are going to be coordinated. The only instances that these operations wouldn't be coordinated is if they were the only entity on site. But in most job sites, you're going to have multiple entities being involved with it.
So if I'm getting that right, basically, when you get to the top of that chart and you have your host employer, they're the ones that are really coming up with the information, and their general duty is to make sure that information is readily available. And then as you work your way down to the subs, their responsibility is to actually go up and approach their superiors or the company above them to actually get the information from them. So everybody has a responsibility. but obviously the responsibility is vary slightly.
It's
correct?
exactly correct, Nick. I mean, it's like I said before. The best way I could describe it is more or less a trickle down effect of information. Everybody's going to be held accountable. That's the way it's going to be. So once we've compiled everything, everything that we've discussed after the entry operations, the entry employer must inform the general controlling contractor in a timely manner if anything occurred, in while entry was being performed and the work was being performed. And key points to take away from that are, learn from it and make the appropriate changes. Controlling contractor must debrief each entity that entered the permit space, discuss the hazards, and report any exchanged information to the host. So again, it's going right back up the ladder, just like we previously had discussed.
So basically, before, during, and after, there's going to be information sharing. It isn't just before, it isn't just after. Information needs to be flowing throughout the different organizations, or I imagine if it's a large organization, up and down that organization in itself on a regular basis. But really what comes down to is, what is entry? I mean, we have these confined spaces, and at what point would you be considered to have entered into that confined space?
I'll get to that in 1 second. I want to add another point that I just recalled from what we were previously discussing. On larger job sites, you typically don't have significant communication problems. Usually, it's pretty strict. Site controllers, general contractors typically will have daily meetings with all the other site supervisors. Smaller sites, though, you tend to have a tendency of seeing this is overlooked. So this hopefully is a way that all contractors can kind of get on board with this. But like you said, what's entry? It's a pretty basic definition. It's more or less the act by which a person intentionally passes through the opening into the space. And a couple key things to take away from that would be any part of the body. It doesn't matter if it's a hand. It doesn't matter if it's a person's head. Any part of the body that breaks the plane of the space, you've just entered it.
So when you're saying breaking the plane, it's kind of like in football. All you got to do is cross the goal line and you're in. So that'd be the same with the confined spaces?
Yes, exactly. I mean, picture a tank that I take the lid off of. Maybe my intentions aren't to completely climb inside, although I could. Maybe I just want to peer inside to check the level of the material that's inside the tank. Well, when I stick my head in to look around, I'm overcome very quickly by whatever materials there were in there, and now I'm rendered unconscious. So just because I broke that plane, I now expose myself, or potentially expose myself, to those hazards.
And I think that's key, because I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about entering into confined space, they're considering getting their full body in there. So why don't we talk a little bit more about the different roles that are played when it comes to confined space, because this isn't just one employee. I mean, at least it should never be just one employee. There's going to be multiple people working on this, and obviously they all have their own job responsibilities and duties. And I guess the first one would be the entrant himself, the person actually entering, whether it be just reaching their arm in or completely climbing in. What's their responsibilities?
Sure, we can talk about that. And I mean, confined space entry can consist of multiple people, or it can consist of very few. It all depends on the work that's being performed and who's on site. But the entrant, I mean, these individuals are typically entering the space to perform the work task. Their biggest responsibility, and I tell people this when we do trainings, that their ultimate responsibility is to ensure that it's safe for them to enter. Sure, they need to know what type of PPE or personal protective equipment they should have on, what type of tools, what other type of equipment, such as ladders or anything else that they're going to need to perform their job function. Yes, that's all important, but when it comes right down to it, they have to ensure that before they go into anything, it's safe for them to do so.
Okay, and then the second role we would have here is the attendant. Now, the entrant, that's pretty self-explanatory, person entering in, but before we even get into the responsibilities of the attendant, what is an attendant?
Yeah, an attendant is an individual or individuals that are stationed outside the space. They're going to be the eyes and the ears for whoever's inside performing the work. This person has a pretty significant duty and responsibility to be doing just that. They can't be swayed by other activities. Their attention can't be taken away by anything else. I mean, if something happens, typically when things go awry in confined spaces, they occur very rapidly, and this individual has to be right there. They have to be pretty much ready for anything. We could see some of the main responsibilities that these individuals have is to be there, stationed on location, in close enough proximity that they can effectively communicate with any and all of the entrants. This person might even be monitoring the atmosphere. They might be running ventilation equipment or ensuring its function. Another responsibility that they have is they have to ensure that other contractors, or for that matter, anybody else, is not posing an outside influence on the work that's in the confined space, causing that job to become that much more dangerous. One thing I also want to add, these new revisions state that these individuals should be trained in certified in first aid and CPR, because if something does happen, they're usually going to be the first ones there that are going to have to act.
So basically they're like the lookout, so to speak.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, then what's the difference between that, an attendant, and an entry supervisor, competent person? We hear the word competent person thrown around a lot. And I assume that's something similar to like trenching, where we have competent people already. So what's the difference between an attendant and their responsibilities and an entry, quote unquote, supervisor, or competent
Good question,
person?
Nick, and you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned excavation work. The definition is essentially the same. The competent person is an individual who is going to have to be on site. Their main responsibility is to coordinate, all the efforts of that job, and their status can be achieved by a number of means. It could be work experience. It could be significant training. It's whoever the employer deems competent enough to ensure that the confined space entry and work goes as planned. And the other key factor with having a competent person on site at all times is they have the ability and the authority to make immediate changes. So the instant that something happens or conditions change or warrant as such for the removal of an entrant, they have the authority to order that and make things happen.
So why don't we talk about what their responsibilities are? So we had the entrant, we had the attendant, and now we have this competent person who is going to be overseeing things. And what do they do?
Sure, we could go over those responsibilities. They're going to identify all the confined spaces at the work site. Like I said, prior to that, though, there should be some communication there with the host employer or other entities. This is stuff that's going to have to be determined by a number of different groups. Obviously, be capable of identifying existing and predictable hazards in the surroundings or working conditions. For instance, if there's some confined space entry work going on and another employer nearby, maybe within range of air currents is using some type of industrial solvent or paint or sealer, or creating a hazardous atmosphere that can affect those entrants, they're able to make changes or stop that work or remove the entrance from the space very quickly. Any unsanitary or hazardous conditions, like I said before, they have the ability to take prompt action, and they could reevaluate the space.
Now we have, like on the previous slide there, we had entry supervisor, competent person. What's the difference? Are they the same? Are they different people? I mean, there's two names there. Is that two different things or the same
Nick, they could
person?
essentially be the same person. I mean, the entry supervisor is going to oversee most of the technical aspects of the entry. They're going to identify the space. They're going to set up probably meetings with the entrants. Obviously, training that could be done at different intervals prior to the work actually commencing. Usually this individual or individuals are going to be filling out the permit, so they're probably going to also have a hand in any of the control measures that were used, whether the blocking of the engineering controls, the elimination of the hazards, perhaps the ventilation. They're going to post the permit, and then also this person's probably going to be relaying any pertinent information as far as hazards encountered in the space to prevent them from being occurrences again in the future.
So they can be the same person, but not necessarily.
Exactly.
Correct? Okay, perfect. Well, we're looking here at the permit required confined space and the procedures, which, so why don't we jump on into that and, take a look here. We've already identified what a permit required confined space is. So what are the procedural
Yeah,
obligations
so
here?
what we're going to do, we're going to take a look down through each one of these numbered items, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each one. We're going to talk about isolation. We're going to talk about evaluating the space's potential hazards, air monitoring, ventilation, conducting tailgate or toolbox talks, safety style meetings, completing the permit, and actually entering the space.
So what is this isolating the space? What does that mean? I'd imagine it's what it sounds, but it still doesn't make
Exactly.
sense to me.
You're isolating the potential hazard. So, for instance, if I were to climb in to some type of storm drain, maybe a catch basin of some sort, and there was a chance that material can flow in above upstream and affect me. Once that material can flow in above upstream and affect me, I'm blocking all applicable valves, pipes leading to it. I'm emptying the space. If I'm talking about a tank, I'm completely purging it. I'm cleaning it. That would include any and all residue that could affect us when we're in there. If we're discussing moving mechanical equipment, we can talk about lockout tagout. We're ensuring that those moving mechanical components have been de-energized, shut down.
So
Locks and
that's happening
tags have been
before you actually
placed
enter,
to prevent
correct?
accidental startup.
Okay, so what about this atmospheric
That's correct,
testing?
Nick.
And what really makes an atmosphere? I mean, when we talk about the atmosphere, are we talking about the air? Are we talking about other atmospheric areas, or is it just? I mean, what does that mean exactly?
Well, yeah, the atmosphere is all around us, Nick. So what we have to be concerned with are any potential hazards thereof. So the first one that we would want to determine, which is essential for life, is oxygen content. We can't breathe, we can't exist if we don't have enough oxygen. So, typically the testing, if this is required, depending on the space, if testing is required, you want to test for oxygen content. We then want to test for combustible gases or other materials, and we want to check for other toxic gases. We could be looking for things like carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, you name it.
Okay, and so this is just a chart of what you were previously speaking about with the atmosphere, correct?
Exactly. So as we're doing our checks, it's important to note that they need to be thorough. Uh, One of the major components of this revision is that OSHA's requiring / recommending employers perform continuous monitoring if the space warrants that. But even the periodic monitoring, or the monitoring prior to entry, you have to make sure that you're monitoring an area that's representative of where the employees are going to be working. And this is just an example. We can say that this is a picture of a tank. So depending on the contaminants, they could affect air quality by maybe displacing oxygen, maybe settling in low-lying areas. And what gets people in trouble from time to time is when the monitoring is not complete enough. They test maybe around the initial opening. Maybe they haphazardly lower the monitor a foot or two down into the space and assume that that's effective. You want to lower the
And
equipment
for those
down
people
in
that
and get
don't
a
know, what
viable
does that
sample
and
for where
why?
the
Why
work's
do you
going
need
to
to
be
go down
performed.
deeper into a confined? I mean, once you're in the confined space, you're in the confined space. What's the difference between the top and the bottom?
Well, like I said, some materials may displace oxygen. For instance, hydrogen sulfide, H2S, you might encounter it or some of its constituents, sewer gas, upon entering a lot of different spaces while on a construction site. Those tend to accumulate in low-lying areas. Well, if that material displaces the breathing air and affects quality, if your monitoring isn't thorough enough, if your monitoring equipment is not lowered down to where the employees are ultimately going to travel,
Okay, so
then your readings
obviously
are
one way
going to be
to
become in
obviously
question.
flush the system, or at least make it more inhabitable, would be ventilation. So why don't we go into a little bit of what how to do that?
Yeah, ventilation can be very effective in reversing hazards encountered in a typical confined space environment. You want to make sure that the equipment is sufficient. We have a note here that you should be ventilating at least 4 volumes per hour, but this is dependent on a number of factors. Larger spaces require more ventilation. I oftentimes caution people on solely relying upon especially mechanical ventilation, because things can happen. The pumps can fail. Something could drive over some of the duct work and cause it or render it useless. So you really have to be careful when you're using ventilation. It can be effective, particularly on spaces where the hazard's been eliminated for the most part, and it's not likely to seep back in or
Okay, so I'd imagine that ventilation and a lot of these other topics should be coming up in our again, we're going back to our football reference in my eyes, but the tailgate talks. So I'd imagine this is where this is all going to be mapped out and explained and discussed.
Exactly, Nick. These are details that all of the employers on site are going to have to hash out and determine. This is all information that would be specific to the entry. It's going to be in what we referred to as a JSA or entry procedures earlier, and it's all going to have to be reviewed.
In the tailgate talks, I mean, for the average company or job site, you're going to have everything from the host down to the subs, right? They should all be included with
Exactly. These? Everybody should be able to attend. I mean, even the permitting. Once the permit's posted at the space, any and all entrants should have the availability to review the information for accuracy to ensure that it's done. We just recommend that companies take the time and they go through the proper steps upon entry. Don't just get in the habit of pencil whipping, these permits. You go to a job site and you see that the general is requiring that permits be filled out. You might get in the habit of doing the same type of entry over and over again. Don't get complacent with just pencil whipping the forms, because things can happen, and that's kind of why OSHA wants a little bit more emphasis put on confined space entry, permit confined space entry in construction sites.
So I'd imagine, so basically communication is key. It always has been, it always will be. And then, when it comes to completing these forms, this is just another, almost, is it like a checklist? It's something that we're going to go through here and make sure we got all our bases covered, correct?
Exactly. The permit is more or less ensuring that people are going to follow the required steps. It's something in writing. We tell our clients all the time that if it's not in writing, it never happened. This is your way to prove that you've done everything possible within your means to make entry safe for your employees, and you've planned out the worst case scenario. I mean, that's what it's about. What we're trying to prevent here is from people showing up on a construction site, opening up a hatch or removing a cover to a space and looking in and saying, oh, everything looks fine, let's just jump in, get what we need to get done and get out of here. The OSHA wants people to make more of an effort, and hopefully by forcing companies' hands and making them fill out these permits and discuss these matters prior to entry, it's going to prevent a lot of fatalities each year.
Well, and then this next slide kind of goes into those, the permits and the forms and stuff like that, but the importance of them. So I'll let you kind of, pick up where you left off on the last slide.
Yeah, so really. we've gone through those series of steps, the whole work scope of as far as getting into a confined space and performing the work function. So we've now entered and we've proceeded with the work. Like I mentioned before, the permit should be posted. Attendants are going to be in constant communication. Entrants they should sign off on the log. They should be basically go hand in hand with the entry altogether. They should have an active role in it, and the permit shall be maintained for the duration of the work.
Okay, so we did our work in the permit, or the non-permitted confined space, and now the work is done. How do we wrap everything up when it comes to the job site, and is there any changes to that?
Well, not really too many changes compared to any other permit required confined space entry. We're going to remove tools. We're going to get everybody back out of the space. We're going to go over, basically debrief, make sure everything occurred according to plan. The only difference is that now everything's going to be communicated back to the controlling contractor and the host contractor or host employer. And any issues that are brought up should be discussed for future reference.
So, and I'm speculating here, but I imagine that OSHA wants to see that information travel back up the chain. This way, the next time we have a job site, and I'm assuming similar confined spaces, then the host is obviously aware of what the last company or companies did in order to communicate that.
Yeah, we might see that. I mean, there could be some activities that you might be able to use pre-existing data for, but I would probably caution against it because conditions can change so rapidly on a site, especially on a job site when you have multiple contractors there. But yeah, the information has to be relayed right back up the chain. That analogy that we kind of gave before, the trickle-down effect, and coming from the top down and then going right back up to the top again. That's what we're going to end up seeing with this.
Okay, so now we're going to get into a really important thing as we're getting close to the end here, which is the rescue. And I know that a lot of clients and prospective clients alike are always interested about the rescue and exactly what needs to take place there and how to go about planning and operating that. So I know we don't have time to cover this in great detail, but can you at least run us through a little bit more about the rescue that comes hand in hand with confined
Sure,
space?
Nick. So confined space rescue, I mentioned before that there are roughly 90 fatalities a year. A large percentage of those are that of other people. People that witness a coworker fall down or be rendered unconscious and they feel it's their civic duty, or even that of just a friend to try to assist that individual. And a lot of times these would-be rescuers are not familiar with what has happened. And I just want everybody to realize that if you ever witness somebody slump over in a space, or they're unresponsive, you can't keep that line of communication. There's probably a good reason for that. And if it's a health matter, maybe just a personal health issue, that's one thing. But if it's a hazard associated with the space, like an atmosphere issue or something else, then you're going to be right in the same boat as that individual. And instead of one fatality, there's going to be multiple fatalities. They often refer to that as the domino effect. You can run into situations where 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people die in a space, and none of them knew of what the hazard initially was. And it's a tough situation to be in. So OSHA really wants to make sure employers on construction sites are going to plan for the worst case scenario. And there are really two main options for this. You can have in-house rescue plans. These obviously would entail having rescue equipment on standby. Everybody would have to be trained on how to use it, how to set it up. Obviously, maintaining is key. And this is typically non-entry rescue equipment. We'll see here, I believe in the next slide, we'll take a look at some pictures of some examples. But that's an option. Typically, training has to be pretty rigorous with that. Then the second is that of a first responder, a third party. And I think a lot of construction companies automatically defer to first responders without doing their due diligence and making sure that they actually even provide the services or even have the capability of performing rescue. And that's one of the main sticking points in this, is if a company is going to use an outside responder, they have to coordinate everything with them down to the last detail. So those responders would have to be on site. They'd have to observe the space. They'd have to verify that they could actually enter and perform a rescue. And then while the work's taking place, employers would have to make sure that these responders are more or less on call. They'd have to ensure that they're available to arrive in a short fashion as quickly as possible to perform rescue as necessary.
Basically, they just don't want people like running into a burning building, and really, on all actuality, it's very
exactly. A lot of people that end up accounting for some of those statistics, they don't know what they're getting into. And like I said, their emotions take over, and it would be difficult to deal with, certainly, but you have to step back and realize that there could be bigger things here. And putting yourself in that position is just you're gonna end up in the same with the same initial result, and that's instead of one fatality, we're going to be looking at 2. So we can see from this slide that there are several different types of retrieval systems available. we don't have enough time to cover all the retrieval systems and all the different options. And certainly there could be some hurdles to using this stuff out on a construction site. I mean, some sites, just because they are ever changing, they're positioned maybe differently or uniquely. Tripod systems might not be the best option. There's always a way around it. It might take a little bit more planning or work, but I think it could certainly be done.
Okay, and that brings us close to the end here. But I guess in summary, Mike, if you're really looking at all this and you're from your perspective, who obviously knows a lot about what was happening before, what's happening now, the key points, the key takeaways of what we've discussed today and what people should really, take away from this presentation we've given.
Sure, Nick. I could summarize it in a maybe a long run-on sentence. The main change with this, the rule now that we speak of today compared to, some of the older requirements, basically now OSHA wants employers to determine what kinds of spaces their workers are going to go into, okay, and that's going to come down from the top down. What hazards could be there, which is fairly obvious. Everybody should know what they're expected to encounter in the space. How those hazards are going to be made safe, so how they're going to be eliminated or dealt with. The training, which is ongoing. I mean, every space could potentially be different and create new challenges. The training's going to have to be relatively comprehensive. And how to rescue people if things go wrong. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. I know we kind of got a little bit of technical when we talked about the different employers' responsibilities and some of the entry procedures, but that's really what this boils down to, those key points.
So it sounded to me like a lot of the stress was on training as well. So keep training. For everybody out there listening, that's going to be really important, is to make sure proper time is taken. Don't rush safety, and make sure you're doing things the right way. So today we are not going to be fielding live questions. Certainly, if you do have questions, and I'm sure that a lot of you are going to have them, contact us. Give us a call, 888-403-6026. Give us a call, fill out one of our online submission forms, send in the safety questions, and also you're going to have that website, a link to our website below that should be down in the bottom of your browser there, lancastersafety.com /OSHA, and I'm not going to read that all out, but click on there, take a look at what we have on our website, take a look at what OSHA has on their website, make sure you're well informed, because again, this can and will affect most companies. And it's important to know what the rules and regs are, because as we've been over so many times, ignorance is just not an excuse when it comes to OSHA. So from all of us at Lancaster Safety, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending. We hope you found this informative. We hope that you'll contact us if you have additional questions. I'd like to thank Mike for taking time out of his day to conduct this webinar, and we hope to hear from you soon. So again, from all of us at Lancaster Safety, we hope you've enjoyed, and stay safe.